Welcome to Season 3 of the Knack for Business podcast. Over 375 episodes strong, we're here to ignite your entrepreneurial spirit with fresh insights, networking gems, and creative strategies that elevate your game.
Question for the audience. How do you grow a business that actually lasts, especially when you're not in a big city and don't have big connections? That's exactly what Birket will talk about today, and how to build a profitable, scalable business from anywhere with the right mindset, planning, and tools. If you're dreaming of starting or growing a business that makes real impact, tune into what Birket has to say about his hard-earned lessons on entrepreneurship, rural innovation, and how small businesses are the true backbone of Canada's economy. Our guest today is Birket Foster from Storm Internet. He's a lifelong innovator, entrepreneur who got his start early at Carleton University, founding mbfoster.com back in 1977. Over the years, he grew that company into a global software firm with 65 employees, selling in 48 U.S. states and 38 countries. His team even partnered with Hewlett-Packard, delivering tools that help connect Microsoft systems with older databases right from the cornfields of Chesterville, Ontario. When internet access became a barrier to growth, Birket made it his mission to bring reliable internet to his rural community, eventually joining Storm Internet and helping take the company private in 2003. In 2020, just as the pandemic hit, he completed the buyout of Storm and has since focused on leading its senior management team to modernize operations, delivering cutting-edge tech. Outside of business, Birket's passions include fishing for muskie and escaping into science fiction. Welcome, sir. It's really a pleasure to have you here today. Do you have a favorite quote?
We like to think at Storm that we're big enough to deliver and small enough to care. And that's a big thing with telecommunications, especially in the rural areas.
You know, having lived on the countryside, I can totally relate to having a little more tech than just a party line that everybody can tap into.
Yeah.
So, you started out at Carleton, and how did that all unfold? How did MB Foster come about? What's the story there?
Actually, there's a story behind the story. Well, the first thing was I was at Carleton and took tax law and business law, along with a bunch of computer science courses. I had a contract to write a random number generator to help with a prototyping and test system so that people could actually say, if you use this, you'll get this much throughput and so on. It turns out you need algorithms to do that, and they were all published in books at the time. There wasn't the internet. And so one of the problems was those books were expensive because they contained lots of math, and the professors that published them wanted a lot of money for those books. Well, they needed like $600 worth of books. Only a company can actually deduct the books. You couldn't do it individually. So I went to R.L. Campbell, my law prof, and said, I want to incorporate a company so that I can deduct my books that I'm using for a contract that I've got on the side while I'm going to school. He said, sure, I'll give you a mark for having formed a company. So I formed MB Foster Associates Limited. The first purpose was to be able to deduct the books. I was going to invest a lot of money in them in order to write the test system. That's where we started. I wrote a benchmarking system that was portable across multiple different operating systems. But that wasn't the real thing that happened. I ended up picking up a team of other students that wanted to work on computers. I would get the contracts and they would work with me. I figured at some point that I would need about 12 people working for me to make it work. And so I decided that was the right thing to do. I would get the contracts, put a scope of work together and go work on it. Just about the time we were ready to finalize the delivery, I'd go find the next one. And that's how MB Foster started, as a consulting company.
Why do you believe that entrepreneurialism is key to Canada's economic future?
Well, one of our biggest problems has been that as companies grow to a certain size, Americans swoop in, often from Silicon Valley, purchase them for $10 million and take them to $100 million. We've lost a lot of businesses that way. Canada's real natural resource is its brain power. We have a lot of things that we can do. If you look at the different technologies that have come out of Canada, especially in the Ottawa Valley with all the telecom and photonics and all the pieces and parts that people cranked out in Canada, that and software. So, Cognos with Powerhouse followed by the entire BI suites. All that stuff came from Canada. Often Canadian companies disguised themselves by having a headquarters in Boston like Cognos did at the time. We should be proud of being Canadian and go there and do it. I finished many a speech by saying, that from the cornfields of Chesterville, we bring you great software. And if you need me, you can call me at 800 Answers, extension 204, which, by the way, I own 800 Answers.
That was good.
Yeah.
Chesterville's local, and if our listeners are listening from the Ottawa Valley, they'll know where that is. But how did that? He's like Storm Internet. You realize the internet's there is no good provision. It's either landline, and even that it's probably dial-up. I still have the reminiscent of hearing the beeps and the squawks from a modem. I'm glad those days are gone. But how was that stimulating your need to get involved? Is a mother of necessity kicking in, or what?
Yeah. So I got this contract to do that open database connectivity drivers for Hewlett Packard for its databases. And it allowed the Microsoft world to talk to the mini computers and mainframes that HP made. And we ended up I ended up having to travel to Cupertino to visit with them and spend a while in, talking with them and doing meetings about what's the next release going to have in it, how are we going to test it, blah, blah, blah. So they decided they had video equipment for HP itself. So they're a big company. We discovered that there was a room you could rent from Bell Canada downtown 160 Elgin. So I would drive in from Chesterville and rent the room. We would end up having a chat with them about whatever it was. I thought, oh, this is actually quite good. Not as good as going for lunch with people, but at least we could get some of the meeting done. And so I started to try and figure out what would it take to be able to do that kind of meeting from Chesterville. It turned out you needed internet, and you have to talk to Bell because they owned the central switch in Chesterville. As it turned out, they said, oh, that's okay. We could get you 256 kb, which if you don't know, that's really slow. But they said, we can get you that, but it'll cost you $32,000. So I thought that was a little expensive. I went out and ran 8 meetings in 6 months for the local area to get those people to know that we were working on getting internet for ourselves, and would they also be interested. It was an interesting time. Ross Video and ourselves and a sonar company out of Finch all got together to talk about hiring engineers in the rural areas because that was also an issue. Ross eventually lost a bunch of engineers to a new facility in Ottawa because they couldn't get the internet they needed in Iroquois. Out of 8 meetings, I managed to get Storm and the people from Regional Canada Cable together enough times that they realized I wasn't going to quit. And that's the grit in being an entrepreneur. And what happened was they combined to take wireless hops from Metcalfe down to Winchester, drop that into a fiber owned by the cable company. I got the first fiber in Chesterville. Because of that, we were connected to a fiber and we could get better speeds than 256K. That helped solve our problem and gave us the research capability we needed to be able to work on the internet. So all of that came from a necessity for the business because the engineers wanted to be able to do research and emails and all the rest of that. Those are among the many things that you have to do to keep the business moving forward. And you have to recognize what your barrier is and what's it going to take to tackle it and get rid of it. The biggest mistake I made was reselling a piece of software, and we were doing quite well with it. And I got ahead of my cash flow because it turns out that some companies that make telecom equipment and worked in the film industry like to pay 90 to 120 days. And I had to pay faster than that. So even though we had 50% margins, I had to go borrow money from my mom to make this work. That's very embarrassing, but I made it work. My mom helped a lot. She's 94, living in Victoria and still driving. So there is hope for me. Anyway, that was the big mistake, not watching cash flow close enough. I recommend to everybody, if they're going to run a business, there's a bunch of pieces that you need to have. One of them is a plan, because you can't just get there without a plan. Number 2 is realize you cannot be a solopreneur. Nobody ever changed the world by being a solopreneur. Even Taylor Swift has a team. So you got to look at it. You've got to understand, how are you going to get the attention of your potential customers? We sell internet. If you ask people who needs internet, they'll tell you everybody. But the answer is the internet I need might be different than the internet you need. And so people need to actually define what's the problem people are trying to solve. So even though the common denominator is internet, some people need it for 6,000 devices in a building, and some need it for one very high-speed computer that's doing cryptocurrency. There's a huge difference in what kind of things you need, but it's all internet at the end of the day. Understanding how to do what are called marketing avatars, to say, these are the 5 avatars we're going after, that's really important, because then you get the characteristics so that you can actually figure out, who are these people? How do I get their attention? Where do they hang out? Do I go to Tech Tuesday and meet them there? Do I find them at the Rotary Club? Where do I find my potential customers? And all of that's an important piece of understanding. People talk about raising money. Bootstrapping is way better. If you can, in fact, next Tuesday is all about bootstrapping. So it's the Bootstrap Awards at Tech Tuesday. The big thing about bootstrapping is you get a customer to be part of what you're doing, so that the customer helps guide you on what needs to happen for your product to meet their needs. Now, you don't want to build it just for them, but at least somebody's paying you to get a certain piece of work done. And that is something that a lot of the younger entrepreneurs just think you go raise a couple $1 million and don't spend it on furniture, please, if you raise the money. I lived in a basement with probably 20 of my employees for a while as we grew. As long as everybody's comfortable working there, it doesn't have to be fancy. When you go to raise money, the best way is to find more customers that care about what you're doing and will help direct you where you need to go. It's a great idea to find customers as your source of revenue rather than selling off a chunk of your company. Entrepreneurship and Canada's future. Brainpower is the natural resource that we need to tap into. We need to take that natural resource, the brainpower, and put frameworks around it. Once you've figured out what it needs to do, you can put teams together that do different things. For instance, in a software company, you have people who are designing software, people who are testing software, people who are supporting software. So those are among the teams that you would have. People are selling software. So there's different groups inside your company, and they might be one person wearing 3 hats when you first start, but eventually there'll be departments. And so you've got to think about, what's the evolution? Who's the best person to put in that role? Do we need to do a strategic hire and bring somebody in from outside to run that? Because we need somebody with way more experience than the person currently in there. Not to take away from the person who's in there, who's doing their best, but to realize that to go the next level, you're going to need something. In my experience, there seems to be breakpoints at 10, 25, and 50. So as your number of employees goes to 10, the world changes. As your number of employees goes to 25, you got to redo your org chart again. And then 50 is another org chart change. So you have to understand, how do you organize people to get the throughput you need in the various departments? And I think that's also part of the kind of things that people need to think about. Chesterville, turns out that the location was not a disadvantage. It was closer to the airport than Canada was. I could make the airport faster than people from Canada. And most of my customers for the Birket Foster products, which is where I started from, turned out to be in the US. I just had to catch planes. And then once I had the partnership with HP, that's an important thing too. If you can partner with a larger company and realize that you are the mouse, they are the elephant, and don't get stepped on. If you can figure that out, how to work with them. Our relationship was from 1996 to 2006, at which point they exited the database business, hoping that Oracle would be their friend, which didn't turn out to be so good. So if you can get a relationship like that, it's amazing, because all of a sudden I was on these roundtables and panels that HP wanted the expertise to be able to talk about how they could help with their mainframes and mini computers feed the data that people needed into the microcomputers. It was an interesting time, and partnering properly gets you way ahead. You can't do it on your own. Nobody can do it on their own. So you need to understand, how's the industry organized, who are the most likely partners, who are the stakeholders in the industry in different niches. With Storm, we've got 189 industries we're in. So there's 150 smart farms. Even inside the smart farms, some are dairy, some are grain, some are maple syrup producers. There's even a guy who uses us to monitor
Pigeons.
pigeons. Yes, sir.
Is that the pecking order?
Yeah, that's the thing. Every business is different, and you need to understand, what are you doing to find those people. So, for instance, we go to the farm shows in order to find the people who want to become a smart farm. And one of the things is they don't have fiber just down the street in the rural areas. So we can bring them high-speed internet. What I mean by high speed is we're currently pushing 2 gigs on a regular basis. 300 meg is our new offering coming up, which we'll talk about later on. It is capable of delivering 300 down and 50 up rurally. And we want people to tell us where they want that. The global part of it was I bought another company. I bought a company that we had been selling the software for, and they were struggling with growing. We were out selling their own sales team. I made them an offer they couldn't refuse and retired the gentleman in charge to the lab because he was great in the lab, but not so good at marketing and sales, which is what happens if you haven't seen, look at the BlackBerry movie, because that's a great movie. Canadian entrepreneurs can't figure out how to get the best technology in the world out to the world, and they had to hire somebody to help them get there, somebody who knew people and kicked in the door to get them the meetings.
Quick question.
Sure.
You mentioned BlackBerry,
Yeah.
and you're offering a wireless service. You're not doing the last mile of the copper run to the client. You're delivering it over the air.
We have 50 kilometers of fiber at Clayton. It was our first done for res. We also have done the entire business park in Vars. So the 417 Business Park was the official name of it. When the red company and the blue company wouldn't cooperate with the ECDev officers, we provided internet to the park, and they loved us. Now Amazon put a building one exit down, a 1 million square foot building, and so everybody wants to be in that park so they can stage their stuff. But that's what happens. And now Bell's going to overbuild us.
I understand that Winchester is the fun and sun capital of the world.
Westerville is the center of the universe, so you just don't know it yet.
One thing I'm glad you brought up, if you live in a city, all you hear is fiber, fiber. My driveway is 1 kilometer long. So unless there's a backhoe in my future, it probably ain't going to be fiber, whether it's fixed wireless or satellite. Can you tell me about those technologies and whether you see them as transitional or what those two technologies do to actually help? And
help complete the solving the rural digital divide.
Yes.
Which is what exists. Let's start by talking about Storm. Storm has its own facilities. We own 262 towers across the Ottawa Valley. We not only own those towers, they have different frequencies and serve different areas, literally from Charlotte Lake to the Quebec border. North Lancaster was our experiment for 100 down and 20 up for res, which is a good thing. So that's part of the wireless technology. But we do resell DSL. We do resell FTTP. We resell cable, both from Rogers and Cogeco. So we actually know how to manage all of that stack and monitor all of it. So one of the big things is a customer that has 5 or 6 locations may actually find us using different media to solve the problem in different locations, depending on what's available. One of the advantages is we're not a one-trick pony. We have products from multiple companies. Now, about low Earth orbit satellites, there's only really one viable solution because it's the one that has the most. But if you want the money to stay in Canada, we can do terrestrial wireless with this new product that we're rolling out at 300 down and 50 up. So what that does is it solves the problem for how do we deliver those kinds of speeds and keep the money in Canada. Telesat is going to do something in 2 years' time. It'll be a wholesale satellite. So we could do backhaul from a particular area, but they won't sell it to residents. Residents and businesses will not be able to buy this unless they want to pay a considerable amount of money. They're going to expect us to have 50 to 100 customers on a ground station. That's what we think anyway. We haven't seen the pricing yet, but they have missed the window by about 5 years, in my opinion. So it's a big problem because Canadian taxpayer is investing a lot in it. And it's probably more bureaucracy than it is entrepreneur and innovation. So did that get your question on the different technologies? They do evolve. The fact that we can do 2 gig wireless, the fact that the new stuff allows 34-kilometer line of sight stuff, and through non-line of sight, it can get 6.4 kilometers. It used to be everything was 10 kilometers, but it had to be line of sight. The world has changed. Plus, it turns out that the stuff inside your building may be more important than the connection to your building. And how your neighbors are. You could get interfered on Wi-Fi by somebody next door that has exactly the same channeling as you do. There's a Wi-Fi explanation on our webinar series at storm.ca/webinars. That kind of will help out probably. Planning for growth from the start. Yeah. So the big thing is I actually took a course that taught me about using your org chart for planning. So you end up knowing what you want to do for business, which has to do with sales and costs. But those sales and those costs, I mean, our costs are 70% people. Between the benefits and the salaries, it's 70% people. And that's typical of a small business. So if 70% of your cost is going to be people, you better learn how to put the most optimum people in each of the slots. And you should look at how many people do we really need to get this done. And so some of that has to do with how many calls a day do you get, how many sales do you need to be chasing in order to make enough money to pay for everybody. All of those kinds of things are quite important for people to look at. And that's why you end up with budgets, and budgets end up with a budget envelope that goes through the department. Eventually you want the department to own its own thing. The biggest thing as an entrepreneur is you got to trust your team. It's a team sport, and you have to trust your team so that they can do what they need to do to produce the best results for that department. And we actually use a system called EOS, Entrepreneur's Operating System, which comes from a book by Gino Wickman. And we use that to run weekly meetings to deal with what are the issues of the day. And that way nothing festers for more than about a week. So that's an important thing. How often does your senior management team meet? If you say quarterly, you're doomed to failure. So that's one of the things. So planning for growth, you got to think about the fact that whatever you're doing today, if you're planning on doubling your business, you got to think about how many people will I actually need? Do I need to double the people? How many customers will I need? Do I have different customers? So I have a typical customer that is actually getting DSL from us might be spending $60, $70 from us. But somebody who's a commercial customer might be spending $3,000 a month, but they're also supporting 50 people in the building. So there's different classes of customers, and you got to think about how you're going to actually service each of them for the entire life cycle of whatever it is you're selling. Even software as a service. There's going to be different kinds of licenses people need to be able to get that done. So anyway, lots of things to think about. And the KPIs that you need to be measuring are, so in sales, most people are confused by sales. Sales is a really important part of the entire business because nothing happens till somebody sells something. And then there's lots of cascading activities that happen from that. So you end up with having to know how many letters did your team write to people? How many of those got a response? How many phone calls did they make? How many second phone calls did they make? It's supposed to be like 8 phone calls to get somebody's attention. So you've got to have people who have to stick with it, gene that makes them phone again and again because they want to help the person out. I mean, it's really about service. Sales is about matching somebody's problem solution because somebody only buys if they have a problem that they're trying to solve. So you try to get a good description of what that problem is and help them solve it. So you need to be looking at how many customer contacts is your sales team doing. You need to understand, are they running $1 million funnel? What's the average close time? Like those kinds of measurements. If you haven't looked at it, there's lots of books on how to do that. And you shouldn't be a straight up sales. You're better off doing consultative selling. If you need a book, Mac Hannon does a book. He used to teach HP and IBM how to do sales. And it was all about consulting with the customer to teach them how their product could actually serve them better. So Mac Hannon's a good read if you want to understand how to do that. But when you first start, you need to know how many days of cash do you have? How many payrolls can you make with what you currently have? If you make the sales that you're supposed to do over the next 90 days, does that keep you in business? In the very beginning, if you don't happen to have a piggy bank, you're going to be working a lot harder to make this happen. So you better know who the customers are. You better know if you're really matching it or they're just being polite. And that's why you've got to be straight up with your customers and make sure that you're aiming at solving their problems. And if it's not working out and we're just wasting a conversation, then you have to move on to other customers. That's all. And one of the things about a business is new technologies come and go, but the people stay. So you have to actually look at it and say, what are the next technologies we're going to invest in? How's that going to affect our customers? Which group of customers might it affect? And you want to look at what's it going to take to onboard that technology. So just like you onboard a person and you get them up to speed on what their job is, so they'll be more useful to you, you also have to onboard a technology. You have to look at the entire life cycle. There's a 360 that you can look at for that. So you want to understand, how would I market it? How would I sell it? What does it take to install it? What does it take to support it? Are there updates that you need to do to that technology? And then when it comes to end of life, how do you replace it? So you actually look at the entire life cycle and you actually ask each department, how does this work for you? Because it's not a solo person making all the decisions. It's got to be the team saying, this is a way we could do it better. If you're reselling somebody else's product, you absolutely need to ask, do they have a list of frequently asked questions? So that you can make your support team familiar with what those questions are, or your sales team, because there's going to be questions on sales and questions on support. So both of those things are necessary. And so bringing on new technologies and fitting them in, you have to understand all the costs that are involved. And of course, we have things that are chunky. So at some point, you end up running into a situation where the next level of routers is like $80,000. So you have to actually understand, when am I going to get to that point for this area, so that you can actually, schedule that into your cash flow, those kinds of things. And remember that stuff doesn't stay there forever. The other thing is, you may find you need to do maintenance on equipment. And as a simple thing, I bet neither of you have actually ever gone and updated the microcode on your Wi-Fi router at your house.
That is true.
Yeah.
I've unplugged it though a couple of times.
Yeah. Okay. So what happens with routers is the manufacturers of those routers, generally speaking, want them around for about 5 years. They will do updates, which are good for security reasons and for performance reasons. And if you're not following along, you may leave yourself vulnerable because the security's gone. So those are the kinds of things that are, the people need to be aware of. When Storm takes care of a customer, especially on the commercial side, they can contract with us to actually manage those routers to the point where we will actually do the microcode updates, so that it'll just a quick little update and reboot and we're ready to go with the new stuff. So we will have tested that in the lab, because we will have 5 kinds of routers that we have, some for commercial, some for res, and we will actually go through the process of managing them to make sure we can remotely access them and all the pieces that need to be with that. So, and that's what happens is residential sometimes are so far behind that it can't connect to new devices, as an example. So that's part of balancing innovation when you try to do that. What else are we going to be measuring?
As you're describing like the fast moving tech, and you mentioned a couple other things earlier. You mentioned Tech Tuesday.
Yep.
And you also mentioned the TIMS program. And for our audience that's not familiar, because if you're not in that space, what is TIMS and what is Tech Tuesday? What shows up there and that would make it advisable for companies in Canada or companies at all, going, you should pay attention to these two spaces, and why?
Tech Tuesday is a local Ottawa event put on by the folks from Wesley Clover, which is the investment arm of Terry Matthews. It happens on the first Tuesday of every month. And this month happens to be next Tuesday, and it's going to be what's called the Bootstrap Awards. So they award stuff to some companies that actually have bootstrapped themselves. The thing about it is, if you go to Tech Tuesday and find them for Ottawa, you will find that they now record them all. So you can actually go back and look at some things, even if you're in another part of Canada, you'd be able to go see the video of what they talked about. Sometimes it's on HR and mental health issues. Sometimes it's on technology. AI it still is a big topic. So there's lots of things in those areas. So that's something that people could think about. Ottawa has a couple of universities and some community colleges. The program at Carleton University is called the TIM program, Technology Innovation Management. They actually will loan you a student to help you with a problem. And that student is writing a master's paper, which will be 80 pages. And what they do is they do research to figure out how to solve your problem. And they use certain techniques that are extremely good at helping define the problem and deliver a solution. I'd recommend the TIM program to anybody in the Ottawa area. Many universities will have an opportunity to do this thing. Carleton just does it really, really well. The program's run by Dr. Tony Belletti, and it has 130 projects a year. And they take on people in industry and perhaps government, but mostly industry, because they'd rather the students were actually working on real problems than theoretical stuff for a startup. And that way, so we used them at Storm for looking at how you load a truck. Why is that important? Well, because if you drive an hour and then discover you're missing a number 7 bracket that you needed, somebody's got to drive back the hour. So that's a big waste of time. So if you look at it, there's inside our business, there's like 5 systems that you need to look at to figure out, is it in the truck? Is it in inventory? Does the tech that's going have the training on that particular device? You could figure out, can they do the install or repair? So those kinds of things. So prior to actually rolling a truck, which of course costs you gas and time. That's all part of it. So one of them went through the process of figuring out how you apply AI to figure out the answer. Other than that, you have to have real intelligence. That was my artificial intelligence joke for the day. By the way, Bernie, just pay attention.
Hang on, my Google Home here is working on the computational answer on it too.
I'm sure. Big thing is when you're first starting out, nobody knows you. Even when you're established, I mean, Storm has been around since 1996, and I still run into people that have never heard of Storm in the Ottawa area. But when you first start, nobody knows you. So one of the things you can do to build trust is doing things like podcasts and giving talks. All of those things help, because what happens is somebody gets the idea about what you do and that you're a subject matter expert, because they want to know you know more than they do, and that you're willing to do the work to do whatever it is to deliver to their problem. So that's a big thing for building trust is, getting out there. Networking is huge. That one of the things is showing up makes a big difference. So yeah, the mayor's breakfast is 7:00. But if you show up at the mayor's breakfast regularly, you'll get to meet a few people, and somebody will eventually have a chat with you over coffee while you're there and discover that, oh, I know somebody who needs your services. So that'll happen, and that's regardless of your location, you'll find that kind of meeting, and you'll be able to actually, in fact, if there's not one of those meetings, maybe you can organize one. Chambers of commerce, people who belong to associations, all of those things are good places to come and listen to what the issues are, to try and come up with solutions, find somebody who's willing to partner with you. And you can say, hey, I don't know everything about this, but we're going to work on this because we've decided it's a good marketplace for us. If you'd like to be one of our first customers on it, we'll work alongside you to solve this problem, because it seems this problem's a pretty big problem for you. So that'll help get trust up there. And when you finish, there's a 90% chance they'll give you a success story. So if you say, look, we did all this work for you, everything's working properly, you might have to wait a couple months just to make sure everything's working properly. But, then you have to be prepared to write the story. I hate to tell you this, but, your end users, they're too busy running their business. But you could write a story that said that Wayne came along and he had this problem. We did this and this. It solved Wayne's problems, and Wayne has 15 extra hours a week because of that. And then Wayne says, yeah, that's what happened. So Wayne only has to put a sentence together that says, it was great working with Storm because they knew how to solve the problem of getting Wi-Fi to work inside a warehouse with lots of steel in it, or something like that. And then you take that and you put it on your website, and you get Wayne to put it on his website, and then it's cross-linked, which also helps you with more people finding you. And then you also, Wayne, the other thing you do is you actually ask the client, do you know anybody else who might have the similar problem? Because that's the references, referrals from people is huge. So that helps you build your business. And, you just have to show up, and you also have to be prepared to help people solve problems. And no, you can't charge for every second like lawyers do.
I sense you see a future that is both prosperous and bigger than what we've currently got. What is the future for Storm and others that you are around for the next 3 to 5 years?
Well, there's 200 of us. So we're a big thorn in the side of the big guys. We do things they won't do. So their preference would be that everybody was in a minimum clump of 5,000 people. They would like to only deal with stuff that has 5,000 people in the area. They don't want to do the small towns. And so that's one thing. Secondly, I can't see them actually ever doing smart farms. It's just not what they do. And, and smart farms are all one-offs. They're all similar, but different. So I see the niche marketplaces where they're not going to go and the Americans always say there's riches in niches. I like to call it niches because I'm Canadian, but there are, if you know how to deal with a niche, then there are people in that niche that will help spread the word about how well you did something for them. So I really think that there's still an opportunity. New technology keeps showing up. So, and both in Canada and the US, there's programs to help get more internet out there. But the thing is that from a practical viewpoint, we can put in a wireless network for about a quarter of what it would cost to bury a fiber. And we don't own the telephone poles. If we owned the telephone poles or we had access to them at a reasonable rate, they might be an alternative. But, given that we don't own telephone poles, it's better for us to be burying fiber. And that's going to cost 4 times what it'll cost to put up a wireless network to cover the same area. So that's part of it. And the government is subsidizing, but they need to actually get the message that on some of this, that they don't have to spend all that money to get the same service. For you, does it matter whether it was wireless or whether it was wired? Very little in terms of applications needs to be wired every time. In fact, the proof of that is, people who have wireless headphones, people who have wireless computers, people who have Wi-Fi, everything. All of that says you don't have to have wired. Are there advantages to being wired? Sometimes, yes. So if you have a lot of people in your neighborhood that are on the 2.4 frequency band on your Wi-Fi, you might be better off plugging a cable into your router from the TV rather than try to do it wirelessly, because you're going to interfere with everybody in the neighborhood, including everything in your house, and the neighbors are going to interfere with your TV too. So sometimes if it's overcrowded channels, that just solves the problem. If you're a mile away from everybody, you don't care. But if you're not, then, it's something to take a look at.
Birket, if this rang a bell for somebody that was listening, whether they're a geek or an entrepreneur, how do we get a hold of you?
The sales at storm.ca would work. There's lots of different ways because my team is helping you define the problems. That's really where it's at. We did put a group of webinars up. Actually, everybody was busy, so I ended up being the spokesperson for our webinars for most of them. But we do have webinars on things, including Wi-Fi, which turns out to be very convenient, but also comes with things that people don't look at, including updating their microgrid. So all of those pieces are part of the thing. But yeah, if people can get a hold of me, you could write, if you want, at birket@corp.storm.ca. That will find me as well. And I'm happy to bring the right resources into play to get somebody the solutions they need.
I want to say thank you to Birket Foster, my co-host Wayne Pratt, and you, the Knack for Business listeners. So just in case you missed it, Birket helps you in the rural communities for connectivity, whether it's hardwired in, fibered in, or wireless connections, right? And it's also a combination of real-world strategies. Whether you're residential or commercial operations, he has a solution for you. And just reach out to him. And he also has, just to kind of repeat, You have webinars at storm.ca/webinars. So you can find out more information about that.
To reach the podcast hosts, email them at info@creativeinsight.com or by the website creativeinsight.com, spelled KRATIVINSEHT.com. To reach Wayne at his email, wayne@motive8u.ca, that is MOTIVE, the numeral 8 and the letter u.ca, or his website motive8u.ca. If you would like to be a guest on this podcast and share your knowledge, let us know. We would also appreciate your feedback on the content or format. Check the show notes for more details. For these podcasts, we like to acknowledge the support and thanks to the following people. Carl Richards from Podcast Solutions Made Simple, a renowned podcast expert. Fred Crouch, who is the Property Wizard podcaster, where Bernie is a co-host. Jovan Strika from At Hive, a co-working space that is more than just a space. Then Melanie Weber, Bernie's invaluable business partner. And Wayne Pratt from Motive 8U Inc., who serves as both a coach and co-host of these podcasts. Disclaimer. Please note that the Knack for Business podcast episodes are meant solely for educational and general informational purposes. The information and opinions contained within are not intended to be professional advice on any subject matter. The thoughts, views, and opinions expressed by the participants are their own personal beliefs and do not represent the views of the podcast hosts or any affiliated organizations. It is important to note that this podcast is not a replacement for consulting with certified experts in your area who possess knowledge of your unique situation. The hosts of the podcast, along with any participants or affiliated groups, do not take responsibility for any actions taken or not taken based on the information presented in this episode. It is highly recommended that individuals seek guidance from their own personal advisors in fields such as accounting, law, or other pertinent areas prior to undertaking any actions or making decisions that may impact their financial, legal, or other aspects of life.